Good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you happen to be. Good that. Today we're talking about the THC and how to adjust it, how to make sure that your THC is working correctly, and the different steps that it takes to set your THC up. And in this case, we're going to be working on a Wright CNC 4x8 table. And we also have a Hypertherm 45 XP sitting off in that back corner. Now, I will give a little bit of a disclaimer as we get started onto this. If you don't have a plasma cutter with a built-in 50 to 1 voltage divider, this could be harder for you, or it could be simpler for you. The THC can read off of either direct voltage or off of divided voltage. So for example, the raw arc voltage. So here is the THC that we use here. And you'll notice on this back end here, we have 2 in the middle. This stands DV, this is divided voltage, negative and positive. Then of course these far external points are our raw arc voltage. And this allows us to read off of the plasma cutter of your choice the voltage that's being expressed between the tip of the plasma cutter and the material. So let's go ahead and take a look at this here. I'm going to move my torch over. So, let's talk about the basic rules of THC. First off, the closer you are to the material, so let's go ahead and drop this down and take a look. Nope, let's get close. All right. Closer you are to the material, the lower the voltage. The further away from the material you are, the higher the voltage. Closer, smaller. Further away, higher numbers. So as opposed to, let's say this was 190 volts, you can bring this down and now you're down to 90 volts. Now this is an exaggeration, but it's something to know when you're working with your THC. It just gives you a base knowledge of how that THC functions. Further away, the higher the voltage. Your voltage is going to be different based on your location, based on your environment. So a hot and humid day is going to read a different voltage from the plasma cutter as opposed to a cold and dry day, because again, that separation there, it contains particulates. It'll have that water, but it'll create all those variants that messes with the voltage reading. So that's just something to consider when working with THC. It's not the end-all be-all of what I'm going to do on 16 gauge today is going to be the same thing as the thing that I do on 16 gauge 3 months from now. There's going to be small variances that you're going to have to adjust. I usually go up or down about 4 volts, depending on the weather out here in Las Vegas, Nevada. Out in the other parts of the country, your variances may be much higher, or you know what, you may just have perfect air, and that's a key thing to know, is having an air dryer is going to greatly improve the function of your THC. You're going to remove a lot of the variants that come from dirty air with, the cleaner the air that you have in your line. So add filters, add dryers, make sure that your air is as clean as possible. You'll have as few variations in your voltage as possible. Now, I'll also mention that the thickness of the material is also going to determine that voltage reading. So a thinner piece of material is going to have a far different voltage than, say, something like this is 16, so I can go to up to an 11, and that's going to require me to drop my voltage. I go to a quarter inch, I'm also going to have to drop my voltage again in order to maintain the accurate cut height. And accurate cut height leads to accurate kerf width. Accurate kerf width means less time having to mess with the end product after you've taken it off the table. Less time necessary equals more money. So let's go ahead and pop back to this torch height controller so we can talk about how this works. So if you're working off your divided voltage, you're going to be able to look on your machine schematics. If it has a CPC port, it has a divided voltage. This reads off of a 50 to 1 voltage divider. If you have that pre-built into your plasma cutter, you can go ahead and plug it into those positive and negative ports on your plasma cutter, plug it into your THC here, and then of course it's going to come off the front end here to the front and bottom port of your control box. So that should make that a very simple transition. Most all of this is pre-built for you. There's a second video that has a little bit of older information that we're going to be remaking that discusses the THC in a little bit more length, especially when it comes to running your setup cuts. You're actually going to be running long cuts in order to determine the voltage. Now when the THC is on, now in this case I'm going to turn my THC on. You'll see that light come on. I have it set at 105 volts. With my THC set up like this, I can actually use it as a voltage detector or a voltage reader off of my plasma cutter. So when I turn on my plasma cutter, I'm going to go ahead and actually just fire this puppy up. You're going to hear a little bit of a noise, so forgive that. You're going to actually see it read voltage when I activate the plasma cutter. Here we go. And fire. Oh, plasma cutter is not on. Now with the plasma cutter on, I'm going to go ahead and watch some voltage here. Now you see, you actually saw numbers scroll across there. That means that the THC is actually reading voltage. This is good. If you're getting that, you can actually start to work with the THC and work with the plasma cutter. And if you aren't getting those numbers, you may have switched the polarity on here. If the polarity on here isn't set correctly, then you're going to experience issues here. Even if you run the test function, which you'll see in that second video, even if you're running that test function, you're going to you won't be able to get a reading off of your plasma cutter if your polarity is off, and it won't adjust anything. The other thing that I should note is on Mach 3 here, you'll notice I don't have the THC button turned on. Now in the previous video about THCs, you'll note that I actually say, hey, turn on the THC function. Now with the updates that I've been running on the Mach 3 for this table, I've actually removed that as a necessary function. You don't need to turn on the THC button in Mach 3 because there's a little handy thing that says run THC without having THC button on in Mach 3. It's an actual function. One of the nifty little features of Mach 3 is it actually allows me to allow THC up-down control even if not in THC mode. That is to say, without the THC button on in Mach 3, I can actually allow the THC up and down control despite the fact that I don't actually have the THC button on in Mach 3. This allows you to override certain functions that this particular THC and Mach 3 don't want to run together. So in this case, I just run it with this on always on all my functions. So I'm going to quickly run a line, and I'm not going to have my THC control on. Also, I'm going to have my THC on by itself, and we're going to go ahead and let this thing run. And I want you to notice that I'm actually just going to be running from 14 inches, a little over 14 inches, all the way back to 0 here. Let's go ahead and watch this puppy run. And we're starting off at 0, 0. I'm going to just tell this thing to go. There are a couple of concerns when it comes to setting up the THC that I also want to address while I have you here. The first being that your 50-to-1 divider, depending on what plasma cutter you have, may not accurately push out that 50-to-1 ratio. That being said, it's a common problem on the Everlast series plasma cutter where that THC actually doesn't give you the entirely accurate 50-to-1 voltage just because of the way they have set up their resistors within the plasma cutter. Other plasma cutters, when you're just reading that raw arc voltage, you should be fine, you should be good to go. Just make sure that you're accurately reading it based off of where you can actually pick up on that raw arc voltage lead on your plasma cutter, which should be available in your manual. Just go check that out for those that positive and negative, those terminals on your system. Just watch for those. You should be able to wire into those. That being said, the THC does a lot of the functioning on its own. You may notice that when you plug it in, one thing I would first check after you've done a couple of those tests, as in the other video, is if you're not seeing any up and down movement, I want you to make sure that you are actually seeing up and down lights signaling the torch up and torch down on this machine. It's critical that you actually see those, because if it's not outputting on this up and down, you're not actually going to be able to do, or the machine isn't actually going to go up or down. So it could be reading voltage but not reacting up and down, and that's based on something called HYS, and that's a setting inside of the Chroma Torchlight controller that you can adjust through here. Let's go ahead, HYS. I have mine set to 4, which means +2 or -2 volts from my target number. It will adjust vertically up to or down to, in order to make sure that I'm maintaining that proper height based on that voltage number. You can actually ramp that number up as high as you want, and if your table is already relatively dialed in, you may not see variances vertically with your Torchlight controller, just because it's actually reading properly. And you can make that more sensitive by changing that HYS setting within the Chroma Torchlight controller. Again, hitting both of those buttons to make sure they both go up and down in that voltage. So that being said, go ahead and let me know if you have any other questions. But that's where I would start with the THC. After you've done that first video, go ahead and make sure that that torch is that THC button is off. And if you do want to double check to make sure that your THC is working, go ahead and ramp that button up. Go ahead and hit this button up 10-15 digits and watch that torch climb. Make sure that you are getting a reading out of it. If you're not seeing torch climb, then we have an issue we have to fix. If your torch is climbing, it is reading, you just may want to change the sensitivity, and that's under the HYS settings on the Torchlight controller.